My family mocked my dreams, then they watched me buy their dream house. I was 23 years old when my father looked me in the eye and told me I was wasting my time. We were sitting at the dinner table in the house where I'd grown up, a modest 3-bedroom in suburban Ohio, and I'd just announced that I was leaving my stable job at an insurance company to start my own business. The table went quiet. My mother stopped cutting her chicken. My older brother, Derek, paused mid-chew and looked at me like I'd just announced I was moving to Mars. My father set down his fork deliberately, like he was performing a ritual. He was a man who believed in stability, in security, in the kind of life that didn't require risk or imagination. He'd worked at a manufacturing plant for 37 years and had retired with a pension that was slowly shrinking. This was success to him. A job that didn't fire you, a house that was almost paid off, a retirement that wouldn't leave you homeless. "You're going to fail," he said. Not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone who had seen many things in life and knew how they ended. "You have a good job. Benefits. Security. And you're going to throw that away to chase some fantasy." My mother nodded in agreement. My brother Derek actually laughed and said something like, "Yeah, good luck with that." My name is David, and that dinner table moment became the defining context for everything that followed. Growing up in our house meant understanding that there was a hierarchy of ambition. My father's ambitions had been modest: stay employed, keep the family fed, maintain the house. My mother's ambitions had been smaller still: be a good wife, raise good children, attend church on Sundays. My brother Derek's ambitions were practical: get a degree in accounting, get a job at a firm, climb the ladder slowly and predictably. And then there was me. I was different from the beginning, though it took me years to understand that this difference wasn't celebrated in my family. It was tolerated at best, mocked at worst. While my brother was content to study accounting, I was reading business books that my parents didn't understand. While he was networking through his university's career services, I was staying up late writing business plans for ventures that didn't yet exist. While he was accepting the first job offered to him, I was thinking about what I actually wanted to build. My parents didn't know what to do with this. In their world, ambition was something you were supposed to suppress. You were supposed to be grateful for the opportunities you had, not constantly scheming for something more. The idea of leaving a stable job to start a business wasn't brave to them. It was irresponsible. It was selfish. It was the kind of thing that happened to other people's children, not ours. The mockery started subtly. When I talked about my business ideas at dinner, my father would smile in a way that suggested he was humoring a child. When I asked for advice, my brother would offer it in a tone that made it clear he thought I wouldn't listen anyway. When I expressed excitement about a new opportunity, my mother would remind me about the importance of having something to fall back on. By the time I was in my early 20s, the mockery had become a kind of ambient noise in our family dynamic. It was the soundtrack to every conversation about my future. It was the subtext of every family gathering. It was the message underneath everything: "You're dreaming too big, you're not practical enough, you're going to embarrass us when this fails." The insurance job was supposed to prove them wrong. When I got hired at a reputable company making a decent salary with benefits and a 401k, I thought finally, they would see that I was capable, that I was responsible, that I could make good decisions. I lasted 8 months before I realized that the job was slowly killing something inside me. Every day felt like a postponement of my actual life. Every paycheck felt like a bribe to stay small. That's when I decided to leave. The announcement at the dinner table wasn't impulsive. I'd spent 3 months planning. I'd saved money. I'd researched the market. I'd developed a detailed business plan. I was as prepared as someone could be to leave stable employment and strike out on their own. But none of that mattered to my family. In their minds, I was simply making a mistake. The mistake they'd always predicted I would make. After my father's declaration that I would fail, the conversation continued around me. My brother talked about a promotion he was expecting. My mother asked about dessert. My father returned to his chicken. It was as if my announcement had already been filed away in the category of things that will not happen, and there was no point in discussing it further. That night, I lay in bed in my childhood bedroom. I was still living at home, saving money for my business launch, and I made a decision. I decided that I was going to prove them wrong. Not to be cruel, not to rub their faces in my success, but simply because I had to. I had to prove it to myself that I was capable of more than they believed. I had to prove that my instincts were worth trusting. I had to prove that leaving security for possibility was a legitimate choice, not a character flaw. Over the next few years, the mockery intensified, evolved, took on different shapes. When my business struggled in the first year, which it did because most businesses do, my family treated it as confirmation of their original skepticism. I heard comments like, "See, this is why you should have kept that job," and "at least you tried," delivered with a tone that made it clear they'd known all along that I would fail. When I had success, small victories, incremental growth, It was dismissed as luck or timing or not really counting because it wasn't a real job. When I worked 80-hour weeks to grow my company, that was treated as evidence of my poor planning, not my dedication. When I sacrificed vacations, social events, and leisure time to build something, that was treated as evidence of my obsession, not my commitment. My brother Derek would occasionally offer what he probably thought was helpful advice. Maybe I should find a job and do the business thing on the side. Maybe I was being unrealistic. Maybe I should accept that this wasn't working and move on to something more stable. Every suggestion carried an undertone of "I told you so," even when he hadn't explicitly said those words. My parents' disappointment was more subtle but somehow more cutting. They'd stopped asking about the business by year 2. When people would ask them what their son did, they'd say something vague like, "Oh, he has some kind of startup thing," with a tone that made it clear they didn't really understand or approve. They'd invested so much emotional energy in the narrative of my inevitable failure that my actual success, when it started coming, didn't quite compute. By year 3, my business was becoming genuinely successful. I was making more money than I'd made at the insurance company. I was building something that was gaining traction in the market. I was starting to attract clients and recognition. But in my family's eyes, I was still the person who'd made a reckless decision, who'd thrown away security, who was probably just getting lucky until his luck ran out. There was a particular conversation with my father that crystallized everything. I was visiting home and I mentioned that I was thinking about buying my first rental property, a real estate investment that I'd been planning for months. My father listened and then he said something that I've never forgotten. "You know, David, success isn't about buying property or making a lot of money. Success is about stability. It's about knowing that you're going to be okay. You're going to wake up one day and realize that all this chasing and striving didn't actually make you happy. You're going to regret not just taking the safe path." What struck me wasn't the skepticism. It was the assumption that my path was inherently less safe, less valid, less worthy than the one he'd chosen. It was the inability to imagine that I might find fulfillment in building something, in taking risks, in choosing possibility over security. It was the fundamental belief that I was wrong for being different from them. That moment, standing in my parents' living room listening to my father dismiss everything I was building, became the moment I stopped needing their approval. I didn't stop loving them. I didn't cut them off or become bitter. But I stopped trying to convince them that I was making the right choice. I stopped seeking their validation. I stopped waiting for the moment when they would finally see me, finally believe in me, finally understand. Instead, I focused entirely on building, on growing, on proving to myself, and only to myself, that my instincts were worth trusting. I didn't do it to show them up. I didn't do it to make them regret their mockery. I did it because I had to. Because the alternative was spending my life in the kind of security that felt like a slow death. Because I had to know if the person they'd dismissed as a dreamer could actually build something real. That was the beginning of a decade-long journey that would eventually bring me back to that house, to that dinner table, with a story that would completely rewrite the narrative my family had constructed about who I was. But in that moment, at 23 years old, being told I would fail by the people who were supposed to believe in me, I simply didn't know yet how far this journey would take me. I didn't know that one day I would stand outside a house in a wealthy suburb of Columbus and hold the deed in my hands. I didn't know that house would be the one my parents had dreamed about their entire lives. The one they'd driven past 100 times, the one they talked about on quiet evenings, knowing they would never be able to afford it. I didn't know that I would eventually buy that house. And I certainly didn't know that my parents would one day watch me do it, and that moment would shift the entire dynamic of our family in ways that none of us could have predicted. The first year of my business was brutal in ways that I hadn't anticipated. When you work for someone else, failure is abstract. You show up, do your job, get paid. If the company struggles, that's someone else's problem. But when you own the business, failure becomes very concrete. It becomes the bills you can't pay. It becomes the calls from vendors asking for money. It becomes the realization at 2 a.m. that you might have made the biggest mistake of your life. I started a digital marketing agency in 2015, out of a shared office space that cost me $800 a month. My initial investment was modest. A laptop, some basic software, and an absolutely unfounded belief that I could convince companies to pay me for services I'd only read about in books. I had no employees. I had no clients. I had a business plan that looked good on paper and a bank account that was slowly draining. The first client took 3 months to secure. It was a local restaurant owner who was desperate for help with his online presence. I charged him $500 a month for social media management. To me, it felt like a fortune. To him, it was probably the cheapest option he'd found. We both needed each other, which was the only reason the arrangement worked. That first year, I made approximately $9,000 in revenue. After expenses, I made almost nothing. I was actually losing money, which meant I had to supplement my business income with freelance work. writing copy for websites, managing social media for small businesses on the side, doing whatever would pay my bills and keep my agency afloat. I was working 80, 90, sometimes 100 hours per week. I would wake up at 5 in the morning and start working. I would work until midnight or later. Weekends weren't different from weekdays. Holidays were just days when fewer people responded to emails. I was living on coffee, determination, and the stubborn belief that if I just worked hard enough, something would break open. My family had absolutely no comprehension of what I was doing. When I'd visit home, my mother would express concern about my lack of job stability. My father would ask, with a tone that suggested he already knew the answer, whether I'd thought about coming back to the insurance company or finding a real job. My brother Derek, now climbing steadily through an accounting firm, would offer sympathetic comments like, "Well, at least you're trying," which somehow made it worse. Nobody asked about the specifics of what I was building. Nobody asked about my clients or my strategy or my vision. The assumption was that I was struggling because my choice had been fundamentally flawed, not because starting a business is, by definition, a period of struggle. Year 2 was marginally better. I had 5 clients by the end of that year, generating maybe $30,000 in revenue. I was still barely breaking even, but the trajectory was upward. I'd learned things. I'd refined my approach. I'd figured out how to deliver better results, which meant clients were happier, which meant they stayed longer and referred other clients. I was starting to see the skeleton of a real business. But my family's skepticism had calcified by this point. It had become immovable. It had become part of the family story. David is the one who left a good job to chase a dream that probably won't work out. When I'd mention a new client, the response was muted. When I'd mention that I'd hired my first employee, a young woman named Sarah who was brilliant at content creation, my mother's response was, "That's nice, but are you sure you can afford that?" I couldn't afford it, actually. Not by traditional standards. But I knew that I needed help to scale, and I was willing to take the risk. Sarah worked for less than she was worth because she believed in what we were building. We both understood that we were betting on the future. During year 2 and year 3, I went through a period where I stopped talking to my family about the business. It was easier that way. It was less painful. I'd call home and we'd discuss things that didn't matter. The weather, the news, what my mother was planning to cook for dinner. But when they'd ask about work, I'd give vague answers. I'd downplay the progress. I'd play the role of the struggling entrepreneur who was probably going to fail because that's the role they expected me to play. It was exhausting, performing that role while simultaneously working myself to exhaustion to prove that the role was wrong. By year 3, something shifted. We had 15 clients. We were generating about $200,000 in annual revenue. For the first time, I was making a real salary, a salary that exceeded what I'd made at the insurance company. I was building something that was becoming genuinely profitable. I remember the moment I realized we'd actually made it. We were in our office. We'd upgraded from the shared space to a small suite with a window, and Sarah was training our second employee. We had projects lined up for the next 3 months. We were turning away work because we didn't have capacity. This was success. This was real. I called my parents that evening to tell them. My father listened while I explained the details. The revenue numbers, the client roster, the fact that we were expanding. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's good, David. That's good that it's working out." The tone suggested that he was surprised or perhaps relieved that I hadn't completely destroyed my life yet. My mother asked if this meant I would finally buy a house. As if the entire purpose of building a business was to achieve the conventional markers of success that they understood. Homeownership, stability, security. It was a good question, actually. I was making good money by most standards. I could have bought a house. But I had different plans for that money. I was thinking bigger. Years 4 and 5 saw rapid expansion. We brought on more staff. We moved to a larger office in a better location. We started specializing in specific industries: e-commerce, healthcare, professional services. We developed proprietary strategies that got results. Clients didn't just stay with us. They became advocates. They referred other clients. They gave us testimonials. They helped us build a reputation. By year 5, we were generating over $1 million in annual revenue. I was making a 6-figure salary plus equity. I was 28 years old and I had built something that was genuinely valuable. During this period, my family's relationship to my success was strange. They were proud, but in a distant, theoretical way. They'd tell people, "Our son has a marketing agency," with a tone that made it sound like something quaint rather than something impressive. When I'd suggest that they visit the office, they'd say they would, but they rarely followed through. It was like they wanted to believe in my success without actually having to see it. My brother Derek, meanwhile, had been promoted to partner at his accounting firm. He was solidly middle class, living in a nice suburb, driving a sensible car, building exactly the kind of life my father had modeled. When we'd see each other at family gatherings, there was an unspoken competition. Not for money or status but for validation. He had chosen the safe path and been rewarded. I had chosen the risky path and also been rewarded. But my reward didn't quite count in my family's worldview because it had come through means they didn't understand. Year 6 and beyond saw us consolidate our position. We hired a full management team. I brought on a business partner, a guy named Marcus who had a background in finance and strategy. We formalized the company, created proper systems, stopped relying so much on my personal relationships and my own work. This was the period where I finally started making real money. Not just a good salary but serious wealth. I was making $500,000 a year. Then $750,000. Then over $1 million. The business was generating $10 million in annual revenue by year 8, and I owned 40% of it. I was wealthy. Actually, genuinely wealthy. The strange thing about becoming wealthy is that it doesn't automatically solve the emotional problems that preceded it. I could have taken the money as validation, as proof that my family was wrong about me. I could have used it to hurt them, to make them feel stupid for doubting me. I could have weaponized my success. But I didn't want to do that. What I actually wanted was to be seen. I wanted my parents to look at what I'd built and understand that their mockery had been misguided. I wanted them to acknowledge that the path I'd chosen, while unconventional and risky, had been valid. I wanted them to be proud of me, not in spite of the fact that I'd taken a risk, but because of it. That validation never came though. Even as my success became undeniable, even as the proof piled up, my family's relationship to it remained oddly disconnected. My father would mention my business to his friends, but in a way that suggested he still didn't quite understand it. My mother would talk about how proud she was, but always with a caveat. Something about how money isn't everything, or how fortunate I'd been, or how I shouldn't let success go to my head. There was an inability to simply say, "You were right and we were wrong. You saw something that we couldn't see and you had the courage to pursue it and we should have supported you." That gap, between what I'd achieved and what my family was willing to acknowledge about that achievement, became the thing that bothered me most. Not the mockery anymore. Not the doubt. But the fact that even overwhelming success couldn't close the distance between us. By year 9 I was 32 years old. I had built a business worth approximately $15 million. My personal net worth exceeded $10 million. I could retire if I wanted to. I could do anything I wanted. And I was still, in some way, that 23-year-old sitting at the dinner table, waiting for my family to believe in me. It was during a conversation with Marcus that something shifted. He'd asked me why I was so focused on buying a house. I'd been looking at properties for the past year, with almost obsessive attention. Marcus assumed it was about the investment, about the financial return on real estate. But it wasn't that simple. I was looking for a specific house. A house that I'd driven past 1,000 times growing up. A house that my parents had always talked about. Not directly, but in the way people talk about impossible things. A house in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Columbus. A house that represented everything they'd always wanted but believed they could never have. I was going to buy that house. Not to prove something to them. Not to make them regret their doubt. Not as an act of revenge dressed up as success. But because it would finally, undeniably, prove that I had been right all along. And maybe, just maybe, it would finally make them see me. The house was exactly as I remembered it. A colonial-style mansion situated on 3 acres in one of Columbus's most prestigious neighborhoods, New Albany. It had white columns, a circular driveway, mature oak trees that had probably been there for 50 years. It was the kind of house that made you understand why my parents had driven past it so many times over the years, always with that wistful tone in their voices when they talked about what it represented. I first saw the listing in March of 2023. I wasn't actively looking anymore. I'd been looking for so long that I'd almost given up on the idea of finding the specific house. But when I saw it, I knew. This was the one. This was the house my parents had dreamed about. This was the house that would finally, irrevocably, change the narrative of my family. The asking price was $3.2 million. For most people, this would be an impossible number. For me, it was achievable. Not comfortable, but achievable. I had liquid assets that could cover most of it. I could get financing for the rest. The math worked if I was willing to make it my priority. And I was willing. I called my real estate agent, a woman named Jennifer who had been helping me search for properties for the past year, and told her I wanted to make an offer. We looked at the house together. We toured every room. We stood in the enormous kitchen with its marble countertops and professional-grade appliances. We walked through the library with built-in bookshelves and a fireplace. We looked at the primary bedroom suite that was larger than my first apartment. Jennifer asked me what made this house special. Why this one when there were dozens of other properties in the same price range that also had excellent bones, excellent views, excellent everything? I didn't explain about my parents. I didn't explain about the years of mockery or the dinner table confrontation or the need to prove something. I just told her that it was the right house and I could feel it. She made the offer at asking price, $3.2 million. The owners accepted within 48 hours. The mortgage application process took about 6 weeks. I worked with a high-end mortgage broker who specialized in large loans. We structured financing to minimize my tax burden. We arranged for inspections and appraisals and all the legal machinery that surrounds a purchase this significant. It was sterile, procedural, methodical. There was nothing in the paperwork that reflected the emotional weight of what I was doing. During those 6 weeks, I didn't tell my family. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Derek. I kept the entire transaction private, known only to me, Jennifer, the mortgage broker, and the legal team managing the purchase. This was intentional. I wanted the moment of revelation to be perfect. I wanted them to understand the magnitude of what I'd accomplished without the time to emotionally prepare, to diminish, to contextualize in ways that would make my achievement smaller. I wanted them to feel the shock of it. By July of 2023, the transaction was complete. The deed was in my name. I held the keys in my hand and stood in the circular driveway of a $3.2 million house, and I felt absolutely nothing. I'd expected to feel triumph. I'd expected to feel vindication. I'd expected to feel some sense of resolution, like all the years of hard work, all the years of grinding, all the years of being doubted had finally culminated in something undeniable. That I just felt tired. I spent the first month alone in the house. I didn't have furniture to fill most of the rooms, so I wandered around in the echoing emptiness, my footsteps the only sound. I slept in the primary bedroom suite that was larger than my first apartment. I sat in the library with its built-in bookshelves and imagined conversations I would have there. I stood in the kitchen and thought about meals I would cook. But mostly I was waiting. I was waiting for the moment when I could finally tell my parents. I was waiting for their reaction. I was waiting for the narrative to shift. In August, I called my mother and asked if my parents wanted to come visit my new house. I'd bought a house, I told her. Nothing specific about location or price or significance. Just that I'd bought a house and I wanted to show them. She seemed excited. He thought I meant a nice house, a good investment. She probably imagined something respectable, something appropriate for a successful businessman. Something that fit within the parameters of what a person could reasonably accomplish. Not this. I picked them up on a Saturday morning in early September. I drove them through the winding roads of New Albany, and I could see them starting to understand that something significant was about to happen. My mother kept asking where we were going. My father stared out the window in silence. When I turned onto the street where the house was located, I saw my mother's breath catch. She recognized the neighborhood. She recognized the caliber of the homes. And then I turned into the circular driveway and I pulled up in front of the house with the white columns and the oak trees. I turned off the engine and waited. My parents didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stared at the house in front of them. The house they had driven past 100 times. The house they had talked about in hushed tones as if even speaking about it too loudly might somehow jinx them. The house that represented everything they'd wanted but believed they could never have. Finally, my father spoke. "Whose house is this?" His voice was uncertain, like he didn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Mine," I said. "This is my house. I bought it." My mother made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. She opened the car door and stepped out, and she walked toward the house like she was moving through water. She stood in front of the white columns and just stared at it. My father followed and he did the same thing. I gave them the keys. I watched my father put the key in the lock. I watched him open the door. I watched them walk through the entrance hall, through the living room, through the kitchen. I watched my mother put her hand on the marble countertop like she was touching something sacred. When we got to the library, my mother sat down on the floor. There was no furniture yet and she started crying. Not delicate tears. Real sobs. The kind of crying that comes from something breaking open inside you. "How?" she asked. "David, how did you afford this?" I explained it in financial terms. The business revenue. The valuation. The percentage ownership. The personal net worth that had accumulated over the past 8 years. The mortgage financing that made it possible. The math of it laid out in a way that was impossible to argue with. My father walked through the house while I was explaining, running his hand along the walls, looking at the vaulted ceilings, opening the doors of the closets like he was checking to see if they were real. When I finished explaining, my mother looked at me and said, "I'm sorry." I didn't understand what she was apologizing for, so she clarified, "I'm sorry we didn't believe in you. I'm sorry we laughed at your dreams. I'm sorry we tried to convince you to give up." It was the validation I'd been waiting for. It was the acknowledgement I'd wanted for 8 years. And now that it was here, I found that I didn't know what to do with it. My father came back into the library and said, "Your mother and I used to drive past this house when you were a kid. We talk about what it would be like to live here. We never thought. He trailed off, unable to articulate the magnitude of what he was trying to say. I showed them the rest of the house. The master suite. The guest bedrooms. The home theater. The wine cellar. The exercise room. The study where I could work. All of it was theirs to use whenever they wanted. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't just about me. This was about all of us. This was about transforming the family narrative from one of dismissal to one of possibility. That evening, I took them to dinner at a nice restaurant in New Albany. My mother was still in a state of shock. My father was quieter than usual, processing. Derek, whom I'd also invited, wanting him to witness this moment, was something between congratulatory and resentful. He'd done well in his own right, but he'd never made this kind of money. He'd never taken the risk that would have required this kind of payoff. At dinner, my mother asked me if I was angry with them. For all of this, the business, the success, the house, was ultimately about proving them wrong, about revenge dressed up as achievement. It was a good question. And I had to think about it carefully before I answered. The truth was complicated. Yes, their doubt had fueled me. Yes, their mockery had made me more determined. Yes, there had been moments when I was working 80-hour weeks when I would imagine the look on their faces when they realized how wrong they'd been. Yes, buying this house was, in some way, a response to their ridicule. But it was also bigger than that. I had built something real. I had created a company that employed people. I had solved problems for hundreds of clients. I had built wealth not by accident, but through strategy, hard work, and intelligent decision-making. I had proven something to myself that went beyond proving something to my parents. So was I angry with them? Sometimes. But more than that, I was sad. I was sad that they'd missed years of watching me grow. I was sad that they'd chosen skepticism over support. I was sad that it had taken this monumental achievement for them to finally see me as I actually was, rather than as the dreamer they'd dismissed. I'm not angry, I told my mother. But I'm not going to pretend that your doubt didn't hurt. And I'm not going to pretend that part of the reason I pushed so hard wasn't to prove you wrong. My father listened to this and then he said something I'd never heard him say before. You were right and I was wrong. I thought that taking a risk was the same as being irresponsible. I thought that dreaming big was the same as being unrealistic. I was wrong about that. And I'm sorry. It wasn't a magical moment. It wasn't the kind of thing that would heal 10 years of doubt and mockery. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement. It was a beginning. Over the following months, I furnished the house. I hired an interior designer who understood the aesthetic I was going for. Not ostentatious but elegant. Not cold but refined. A house that would impress but also a house that would feel like home. My parents visited frequently. They invited friends over to see it. I watched my mother point out specific rooms with a kind of pride that suggested she was showing off not the house, but me, the son who had made this possible. Derek visited as well. He seemed smaller in that house somehow. His accomplishments, which I'm sure seemed significant to him, seemed to pale in comparison to what I'd built. I felt a kind of pity for him. He'd chosen the safe path and the safe path had rewarded him adequately. But it had never allowed him to transcend. It had never allowed him to dream in the way I'd been forced to dream. By the end of 2023, the house felt like home. But it also felt like something else, like the punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. Like proof that had been presented. Like a narrative that had been conclusively rewritten. The mockery had stopped. The doubt had been replaced with something that looked like respect. My parents had finally seen me. But I wondered sometimes whether what they were seeing was actually me or whether they were seeing the house. Whether they were proud of who I was, or whether they were impressed by what I'd accomplished. And I wondered if I would ever really know the difference. 6 months after buying the house, I sat in the library, the one with the built-in bookshelves in the fireplace, and I realized something that should have been obvious all along. Owning this house hadn't actually changed anything fundamental about my relationship with my family. My parents were proud of me now. That part was real. They bragged about me to their friends. They showed off the house like it was a trophy. They attended business events and talked about their son the entrepreneur with a tone of voice that suggested they'd always believed in me, even though we both knew that wasn't true. But the underlying hurt was still there. The years of mockery hadn't been erased. The doubt hadn't been forgotten. The feeling of not being seen, not being believed in, not being supported, that was still embedded in our dynamic, just covered up by the veneer of success. I'd spent a decade chasing a moment that I'd imagined would fix everything. I'd imagined that the moment my parents saw this house, the moment they understood the magnitude of what I'd accomplished, everything would shift. We would hug. We would cry. We would have some kind of emotional breakthrough where they would acknowledge their mistakes and I would forgive them, and we would move forward as a healed family. That moment never came. Instead, what happened was more subtle and, in some ways, more painful. My parents accepted the narrative shift without really examining what had caused it. They accepted that I was successful. They accepted that their doubt had been misguided. But they didn't really confront the fact that they'd spent 10 years actively trying to make me smaller, trying to convince me to give up, treating my ambition like it was evidence of poor judgment rather than strength of character. They just moved on. In February of 2024, I invited my parents and Derek to spend a weekend at the house. I wanted to do something meaningful with the space, something that would actually cement it as a family gathering place rather than just a monument to my success. I hired a chef to prepare a nice dinner. I invited them to stay overnight. I wanted to create moments where we could actually be together in a way that felt genuine. The dinner was pleasant but hollow. My parents praised the food, the house, the wine. Derek asked about the property taxes and the mortgage interest rates. Practical questions that somehow missed the point of why I'd invited them. We talked about surface-level things. The weather, the news, upcoming family events. No one addressed the elephant in the room, which was the fact that we were gathered in a house that existed because of a gulf between us. After dinner, my father asked to take a walk around the property. We walked the 3 acres in the gathering darkness and he pointed out things he thought could be improved. A garden here, some landscaping there. He talked about the property like it was a puzzle to solve rather than something to appreciate. At one point he turned to me and said, "This is impressive, David. Really impressive. I'm proud of you." Those words should have felt good. They should have felt like the validation I'd been waiting for. But instead they felt empty. They felt like words that were supposed to fix something that couldn't actually be fixed with words. "Are you proud of me?" I asked him, "or are you proud of the house?" He didn't understand the question. Or maybe he understood it too well and didn't want to answer it. "What's the difference?" he asked. That was the moment when something crystallized for me. The difference was everything. The difference was the distinction between being proud of a person for who they are and being impressed by what they've accumulated. The difference was between believing in someone and admiring their success in retrospect. My father had never believed in me. He had believed in me once I'd proven myself beyond any reasonable doubt. And now he was trying to retroactively claim credit for supporting a vision he'd actually tried to destroy. I didn't argue with him. I just walked back to the house in silence. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the primary bedroom suite that was larger than my first apartment, in a house that cost more than my parents had made in a lifetime of work, and I felt profoundly alone. I thought about Derek with his stable accounting job and his predictable life. I thought about my parents with their modest ambitions and their limited worldview. I thought about the 10-year journey from that dinner table confrontation to this moment, standing in a house that should have felt like victory but instead felt like something else entirely. I thought about whether I'd made a terrible mistake. The next morning I did something that surprised everyone. I told my parents that I wanted to help them. I offered to pay off their mortgage. They had about $80,000 remaining. I offered to help them pay for some home improvements they'd been putting off for years. I offered to ensure that they never had to worry about money for the rest of their lives. My mother cried. My father looked uncomfortable. Derek looked jealous. "Why would you do that?" my father asked. "Because I can," I said. "And because it's the right thing to do." But that wasn't the whole truth. Part of it was guilt. Part of it was an attempt to buy the thing I actually wanted, which was genuine connection. Part of it was realizing that the house hadn't done what I'd hoped it would do, so I was trying to find another solution to the same problem. My parents accepted the help. I set up a plan where I would pay off their mortgage and establish a trust fund that would provide for them in their retirement. It was generous. It was also in some way a way of saying, "You failed to believe in me, so now I'm going to take care of you, which will force you to feel indebted to me for the rest of your lives." I'm not proud of that motivation. But I'm honest about it. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. My parents, freed from financial stress, started to actually enjoy their lives. My mother joined clubs. My father took up gardening. They traveled. They seemed happier than I'd ever seen them. And I realized something that I'd never considered. Maybe their doubt about my dreams hadn't come from malice. Maybe it had come from fear. Fear that I would fail and suffer. Fear that I would take a risk and it would destroy me. Fear that I was smarter and braver and more ambitious than they were. And that terrified them because it meant I would leave them behind. They hadn't been trying to make me smaller. They'd been trying to protect me from a danger they believed was inevitable. That realization didn't erase the hurt. But it contextualized it. It made it possible to see them not as villains in my story, but as frightened people doing the best they could with the tools they had. By the end of 2024, my life looked like this. I owned a $3.2 million house. I had a business worth $15 million. I had a personal net worth exceeding $10 million. My parents were financially secure. My mother bragged about me constantly. My father nodded along when she did, with an expression that suggested he was still processing how his son had become a version of success that he'd never quite understood. And I was still, in some ways, that 23-year-old kid waiting for someone to believe in me. The difference was that now I understood. No one else could ever believe in me the way I needed to be believed in. No amount of external validation could fill the void that comes from not being seen by the people who raised you. No house, no matter how impressive, could compensate for those lost years of support. What I'd actually learned, the real lesson buried under all the financial success, was that the point of proving someone wrong isn't to make them regret their doubt. The point is to prove something to yourself. The point is to become someone who doesn't need them to believe anymore. The point is to build a life so real and so genuinely your own that whether or not they believe in it becomes irrelevant. I'd done that. I'd built a life that was undeniably mine. I'd built a business that solved real problems for real people. I'd built wealth through intelligence and hard work and strategic thinking. Those things were real regardless of whether my parents had ever believed in them. The house was just the symbol. The real achievement was everything that had enabled me to buy it. In quiet moments, I sometimes thought about what I would tell that 23-year-old version of myself, sitting at the dinner table after being told I would fail. I would tell him that his father was right about one thing. It would be harder than he expected. It would take longer. It would cost more than he anticipated, not in money but in sacrifice, in loneliness, in the pain of building something alone. But I would also tell him that he would do it anyway. I would tell him that 10 years later he would own a house that his parents had dreamed about. I would tell him that his mother would cry when she saw it. I would tell him that his father would eventually say that he was proud. And I would tell him that none of those things would matter as much as he thinks they will. What would actually matter was the person he became in the process of building it all. What would matter was the strength he developed, the resilience he cultivated, the belief in himself that he had to create from nothing because no one else was going to give it to him. That was the real victory. Not the house. Not the business. Not the moment when his parents finally believed. But the person he became while proving that their doubt was misguided. That was what actually mattered. I still own the house. My parents still visit frequently. My father still points out things that could be improved. My mother still brags about it to her friends. Derek still seems somehow smaller when he walks through the rooms, confronted with a success he'd never quite matched. And I still, sometimes, feel that ghost of the person who was mocked at that dinner table, waiting for validation that ultimately can never come the way he imagined it would. But mostly I've moved on. I've moved on to building the next thing, to pursuing the next dream, to creating the next version of success. Because I've learned that the external markers of achievement are less important than the internal knowledge that you were brave enough to pursue what you believed in, even when everyone you loved told you it was a mistake. That's the real house that matters. That's the real foundation that lasts. Everything else is just rooms.